At 22,000 feet over Rabaul on February 14, 1943, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh felt his F4U Corsair shudder as tracers streaked past his canopy. 2 Japanese Zeros had materialized from a cloud bank, and the lead aircraft was already adjusting deflection for a killing shot. Walsh had maybe 3 seconds. His training from Pensacola screamed one solution: a hard climbing turn to the right, use the Corsair's power to escape vertically. But Walsh had seen what happened to pilots who climbed away predictably. They became slow, hanging targets. What Walsh did next contradicted every instruction he'd received about the Corsair. He snapped the stick hard left, rolled completely inverted at 400 miles per hour, and shoved the stick forward. The world flipped. Sky became ocean. His seat straps bit into his shoulders as negative G forces slammed blood toward his head. His vision went crimson. The instrument panel blurred into meaningless shapes. For 2 endless seconds, he flew essentially blind, trusting muscle memory and the Corsair's brutal structural strength. When he rolled wings level again at 15,000 feet, the Zero was a shrinking dot 3,000 feet above him, its pilot frantically searching empty sky for a target that had simply vanished. Walsh had survived. And he'd just discovered a tactic that would fundamentally alter how Navy and Marine Corps pilots fought in the Pacific. The inverted roll at maximum speed became the Corsair pilot's secret weapon, a maneuver so violent, so physiologically punishing, that it gave American aviators an escape option Japanese pilots couldn't follow and often didn't survive attempting. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This maneuver violated explicit warnings from Vought aircraft engineers and Navy flight instructors. The official technical manual for the F4U specifically cautioned against prolonged inverted flight and negative G maneuvers. Engine oil pressure could drop, fuel flow might interrupt, structural loads could exceed design limits. The human cardiovascular system wasn't built to handle blood pooling in the brain. Aviation medicine journals from 1942 cited negative 2G as approaching the limit of safe human tolerance. Walsh had just pulled somewhere between negative 3 and negative 4G, held it through the roll, and not only survived but gained a decisive tactical advantage. The men who flew Corsairs into combat between 1943 and 1945 weren't reckless. They were desperate. Conventional tactics against the Mitsubishi A6M Zero had produced kill ratios that ranged from barely even to catastrophically unfavorable. Pilots who followed doctrine died. Pilots who improvised, who pushed their aircraft and their bodies beyond supposed limits, came home. The story of high-speed inverted tactics in Corsairs isn't about glory or heroism. It's about brutal math, the calculation that temporary blindness and potential structural failure were better odds than staying predictable in a Zero pilot's gunsight. The chance Vought F4U Corsair entered combat service with Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 124 inches, February 1943, at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. It arrived with a reputation problem. Navy carrier qualification trials had been disastrous. The long nose blocked forward visibility during landing approaches. The stiff landing gear caused dangerous bounce on carrier decks. The aircraft was hot, meaning it required higher approach speeds than the F4F Wildcat it was meant to replace. The Navy decided Corsairs would be land-based with the Marines while carrier squadrons continued flying Wildcats. But what made the Corsair problematic for carrier operations made it lethal in combat. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than any single-engine fighter then in service. That power translated to speed. A clean Corsair could reach 417 miles per hour in level flight and exceed 450 in a dive. The Zero, by comparison, topped out around 330 miles per hour and became dangerously unstable past 400 in a dive. The Corsair's wing loading was higher than the Zero's, which meant it couldn't match the Japanese fighter's turning radius in horizontal combat. But that same high wing loading gave the Corsair phenomenal roll rate and dive performance. The aircraft could transition from level flight to a 60-degree bank in under 2 seconds. It could enter a dive and accelerate past speeds that would tear a Zero's control surfaces off. These weren't just performance advantages. They were the difference between tactical options and tactical suicide. Marine pilots arriving at forward bases in the Solomons received standard fighter doctrine. Maintain energy advantage, use speed to engage and disengage at will, avoid turning fights with Zeros, textbook boom and zoom tactics. But combat in the Southwest Pacific didn't follow textbook scenarios. Japanese pilots by early 1943 had refined ambush tactics specifically designed to force American fighters into low-speed turning engagements where the Zero's agility became decisive. The Zeros operated from bases like Rabaul with veteran pilots who understood exactly how to bait American fighters into vulnerable positions. They'd fly in loose formations at medium altitude, appearing as easy targets. When a Corsair pilot committed to an attack run, 2 or 3 Zeros would drop from above or slide in from the flanks, forcing the American fighter defensive. Defensive in Pacific air combat meant one of 2 choices: try to outturn the Zero, which was impossible, or try to extend away, which often meant climbing, which bled energy and made the Corsair slow and predictable. Squadron. Commanders filed after-action reports that painted a stark picture. Marine Fighting Squadron 124 lost multiple aircraft in their first weeks of combat. Pilots who engaged Zeros in turning fights didn't return. Pilots who tried to climb away after initial attacks found Zeros staying with them longer than expected, getting gun solutions before the Corsair's speed advantage could create separation. The fundamental problem was predictability. Japanese pilots knew American fighters would try to use power and speed to escape. They'd learned to anticipate climb angles, to position themselves to intercept, to maintain just enough contact until the American fighter ran out of altitude or airspeed or ideas. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh understood this problem viscerally. He'd nearly been shot down twice in his first week flying combat missions out of Guadalcanal. Both times, he'd followed doctrine boom attacks from altitude, then climbing extensions to break contact. Both times, Zero pilots had anticipated his escape vector and nearly achieved firing solutions. Walsh survived those encounters partly through luck and partly because the Zero pilots weren't quite skilled enough to convert their positional advantage into a kill. But Walsh knew luck was finite. Combat flying demanded solutions, not hope. The inverted role emerged from Walsh's background as a dive bomber pilot before he transitioned to fighters. Dive bombers routinely pulled negative G during their attack runs as pilots pushed over into their dives. Walsh understood what negative G felt like. He knew the red-out effect, the sensation of blood pooling in his head, the way vision narrowed to a red-tinged tunnel. He also knew it was temporary and survivable. So when that Zero got behind him over Rabaul in February 1943, Walsh's response wasn't panic. It was calculation. Rolling inverted at 400 miles per hour accomplished several things simultaneously. First, it broke the Zero pilot's tracking solution instantly. The Japanese pilot was expecting a climb, a turn, or a dive. An aircraft flipping completely upside down and then pulling through created motion in a vector that required complete mental recalibration. By the time the Zero pilot understood what was happening, Walsh had already converted 3,000 feet of altitude into separation distance. Second, the maneuver maintained the Corsair's energy state. Unlike a climbing turn, which bled airspeed, the inverted roll led immediately into a dive that preserved or even increased velocity. Walsh came out of the maneuver with just as much energy as he entered it, but in a completely different position relative to his attacker. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the maneuver exploited the Corsair's structural strength against the Zero's vulnerability. The F4U was built like a battleship. Its airframe could handle loads that would destroy lighter aircraft. Vought engineers had designed it to withstand carrier landing impacts, which meant the structure had safety margins that exceeded normal combat flight loads. When Walsh rolled inverted and pulled negative G, he was stressing the airframe, but well within its actual capabilities, even if beyond its official recommendations. The Zero couldn't follow. Japanese pilots who attempted to track Corsairs through high-speed inverted maneuvers faced immediate problems. The Zero's fuel system used a simple gravity feed design. Inverted flight disrupted fuel flow to the Nakajima Sakai engine. Even brief inverted attitudes could cause power loss, and power loss in a dive while trying to track an enemy fighter was often fatal. The Zero's airframe, optimized for lightness and maneuverability, had reduced safety margins in negative G flight. Control surfaces could flutter, wing structures could fail. Several documented incidents from 1943 involve Zeros breaking up during attempts to follow Corsairs through aggressive inverted maneuvers. Walsh shared his discovery with other pilots in VMF 124. The technique spread through informal channels, conversations in ready rooms, debriefs after missions, demonstrations during training flights. There was no official documentation. Flight instructors back in the United States never taught this. The tactical development boards at Naval Air Station Jacksonville had no record of inverted combat tactics. This was pure field innovation, born from necessity, validated through survival. By mid-1943, Corsair pilots throughout the Solomons were incorporating inverted rolls into their defensive repertoire. The maneuver became known by various names: the flip and dive, the roll through, the high-speed invert. Some pilots preferred rolling right, others left, depending on which direction felt more natural under stress. The specifics mattered less than the core principle. When a Zero achieved a firing position, don't do what the Zero pilot expects. The physiological cost was real. Negative G flight caused severe discomfort. Blood vessels in the eyes engorged, creating the characteristic red-out effect. Some pilots experienced headaches after missions involving inverted maneuvers. A few reported minor vision problems, floaters, temporary blind spots. Aviation medical officers at forward bases documented these symptoms, but had no context for understanding them. Research on negative G effects was minimal. The Navy's aviation medicine establishment operated on pre-war assumptions about human tolerances that combat was systematically proving inadequate. Pilots didn't care about medical theory. They cared about survival statistics. And the statistics were clear. Corsair squadrons that adopted high-speed inverted tactics saw their loss rates drop and their kill ratios improve. Marine Fighting Squadron 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron led by Gregory Boyington, used inverted maneuvers as standard defensive procedure by late 1943. Squadron records show a kill ratio exceeding 10-1 against Japanese aircraft, much of it attributed to superior defensive tactics that kept Corsairs alive long enough to re-engage on favorable terms. The tactic evolved beyond pure defense. Aggressive pilots began using inverted rolls offensively, flipping over the top of zero formations and diving through them at speeds the Japanese fighters couldn't match. This created chaos in Japanese formations and forced Zero pilots to break their own tactical cohesion. A documented engagement from January 1944 over Bougainville illustrates this perfectly. 8 Corsairs from VMF 214 encountered 12 Zeros at 18,000 feet. Instead of the expected boom and zoom attack, the Corsair flight leader, Captain Donald Aldrich, led his formation in a climbing attack, then rolled inverted at the apex and dove through the Zero formation at maximum speed. The Zeros scattered. Their formation integrity collapsed. Individual Japanese pilots found themselves isolated, facing Corsairs that could dictate engagement terms. The Marines shot down 5 Zeros without loss. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese pilots filed reports describing American aircraft performing maneuvers that seemed suicidal high-speed inverted flight through formations, pilots apparently accepting temporary loss of control to achieve positional advantage. Intelligence assessments from Rabaul in mid-1943 noted with concern that American fighter tactics had become increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. This was strategically dangerous for Japanese forces because it undermined the core assumption that guided their fighter doctrine, that American pilots valued survival over victory and would disengage when pressed. The inverted roll demonstrated the opposite. American pilots were willing to endure physiological punishment and accept structural risk to maintain combat effectiveness. This wasn't recklessness, it was calculated aggression based on understanding what their aircraft could actually handle versus what official guidance said they should handle. The gap between engineering caution and combat reality was where tactical advantage lived. The Corsairs' inverted capabilities became more sophisticated as pilots gained experience. By late 1943, experienced Corsair aviators could perform what they called the double roll-through inverting, diving rolling level, immediately re-inverting, and diving again. This created a corkscrew flight path that was nearly impossible for Zero pilots to track. The Japanese pilots who attempted to follow through these maneuvers faced compounding problems: fuel flow disruption, increasing structural loads, and the cognitive burden of tracking a target moving in 3 dimensions through maneuvers their own aircraft couldn't safely replicate. The technical limitations Japanese pilots faced weren't just about aircraft performance. They were about doctrine, training, and the fundamental assumptions that governed how Japan prosecuted air warfare in the Pacific. By 1944, those assumptions had become liabilities that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. Japanese naval aviation doctrine in the early war years emphasized individual pilot excellence and aircraft agility. The Zero represented this philosophy perfectly, a lightweight, maneuverable fighter flown by extensively trained aviators who could exploit every advantage in turning combat. This approach had worked brilliantly over China and in the war's opening campaigns, but it couldn't adapt to the kind of warfare American pilots were developing over the Solomons and New Guinea. When Zero pilots encountered Corsairs performing high-speed inverted maneuvers, their training provided no effective response. Japanese flight schools taught dogfighting fundamentals: lead, pursuit, lag pursuit, high and low yo-yos, all predicated on maintaining visual contact and achieving firing solutions through superior position. These techniques assumed both aircraft were operating within similar performance envelopes. The inverted roll at 400 miles per hour broke that assumption entirely. A documented incident from March 1944 over Rabaul illustrates the tactical disconnect. Lieutenant Robert Hansen, flying with VMF 215, was engaged by 4 Zeros at 20,000 feet. When the lead Zero achieved a 6 o'clock position, Hansen rolled inverted and dove. The Zero pilot followed, attempting to maintain his tracking solution. Hansen's Corsair accelerated past 420 miles per hour in the dive. The pursuing Zero began experiencing severe vibration around 380 miles per hour, the onset of compressibility effects that the aircraft wasn't designed to handle. The Japanese pilot faced an impossible choice: pull out early and lose the target, or continue the dive and risk structural failure. He chose to pull out. Hansen leveled at 8,000 feet, executed a climbing turn with energy to spare, and found himself above and behind the 3 remaining Zeros. He shot down 2 before the survivors disengaged. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. The inverted roll hadn't just saved Hansen's life. It had reversed a 4 versus 1 disadvantage into a hunting opportunity. This pattern repeated across the Pacific Theater throughout 1944. Corsair pilots used inverted tactics to survive defensive situations and transition immediately to offensive positions. The maneuver wasn't an escape, it was a reset that allowed the American pilot to dictate the next phase of combat on favorable terms. Japanese pilots increasingly found themselves trapped in a tactical paradox. Conventional attacks on Corsairs were increasingly ineffective because the American fighters could simply roll inverted and exit the engagement faster than Zeros could follow. But breaking off attacks meant ceding air superiority, which was strategically unacceptable for Japanese forces trying to defend critical bases. Some Japanese pilots attempted to develop counters to inverted tactics. Intelligence reports from captured documents and post-war interviews reveal that by late 1944, experienced Japanese aviators understood the basic mechanics of what American pilots were doing. They knew Corsairs would roll inverted when defensive. They attempted to anticipate the maneuver, positioning themselves to intercept after the American fighter completed its dive and began climbing back to altitude. This counter-tactic occasionally worked against inexperienced Corsair pilots who followed predictable patterns. But veteran American aviators adapted immediately. Instead of rolling inverted and diving straight down, they'd roll inverted and dive at an angle, then roll level and reverse direction before climbing. Or they'd perform a half roll, dive, then snap roll the opposite direction and climb vertically. The variations were endless, and each one exploited the Corsair's superior roll rate and structural strength. The fundamental problem for Japanese forces was that their most numerous fighter, the Zero, simply couldn't compete in this kind of combat. Later variants of the Zero, the A6M5 and A6M6, had strengthened airframes and improved dive performance. But these modifications added weight, which reduced the very agility that made the Zero effective in the first place. And even the improved models couldn't match a Corsair's dive speed or structural resilience. New Japanese fighter designs attempted to address these shortcomings. The Kawanishi N-1KJ Shiden and the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden had stronger structures, more powerful engines, and better high-speed handling. In theory, these aircraft could follow Corsairs through inverted maneuvers. In practice, they arrived too late, and, in numbers too small to matter. By the time these improved fighters reached operational squadrons in meaningful quantities, the tactical and strategic situation had shifted decisively against Japan. Japanese pilot training programs couldn't adapt quickly enough either. By mid-1944, Japan was losing experienced aviators faster than they could be replaced. The quality of replacement pilots declined sharply. Training programs that had once lasted 2 years were compressed to 6 months, then 4 months, then less. New pilots received basic flight instruction and fundamental gunnery training. There wasn't time or fuel to teach energy management, vertical tactics, or how to counter the specific techniques American pilots were employing. Meanwhile, American training programs had systematically incorporated combat lessons. Replacement Corsair pilots arriving in the Pacific in late 1944 already knew about inverted defensive tactics before they flew their first combat mission. Flight instructors at advanced training bases in Hawaii and California were combat veterans who'd rotated back to teach. They demonstrated inverted roles. They explained the physiological effects. They showed new pilots how to recognize the moment when rolling inverted was necessary and how to execute the maneuver without hesitation. This knowledge transfer represented a massive institutional advantage. The American military system could learn from combat experience and propagate those lessons throughout the training pipeline within months. The Japanese system, strained by resource limitations and doctrinal rigidity, could not. The gap in tactical sophistication widened continuously throughout 1944 and into 1945. The physiological aspects of inverted flight eventually received official attention, though not through normal channels. Navy flight surgeons at forward bases began documenting the effects of negative G exposure on Corsair pilots. They found that while the readout effect was universal, individual tolerance varied significantly. Some pilots could handle sustained negative 3G with minimal after effects. Others experienced severe headaches and vision problems after brief negative G exposure. Medical officers developed informal screening methods. They'd have pilots perform inverted maneuvers during training flights and assess their reactions. Pilots who handled negative G well were encouraged to use inverted tactics when necessary. Pilots who showed poor tolerance were advised to rely on other defensive options. This wasn't official policy, it was field medicine, adapting to combat realities that aviation medicine textbooks hadn't anticipated. The same pattern of improvisation occurred with aircraft maintenance. Corsair ground crews noticed that aircraft flown by pilots who regularly performed inverted maneuvers showed different wear patterns than aircraft flown more conventionally. Engine mounts experienced unusual stress loads. Oil systems needed more frequent inspection. Certain structural points showed accelerated fatigue. Experienced crew chiefs developed unofficial maintenance protocols for aircraft that regularly flew inverted. They'd inspect specific airframe stress points after every few missions. They'd modify oil systems slightly to improve flow during negative G flight. These modifications were never documented in official maintenance manuals, but they spread through the maintenance community the same way tactical innovations spread through pilot communities, through direct person-to-person knowledge transfer at forward bases. By early 1945, the tactical environment in the Pacific had shifted so decisively in favor of American forces that Japanese fighters rarely achieved advantageous positions against Corsairs. The remaining experienced Japanese pilots were vastly outnumbered. Replacement pilots with minimal training were being sent into combat against American aviators who had institutional knowledge of tactics that had been refined through 2 years of continuous combat. The kill ratios reflected this disparity. Corsair squadrons in 1945 routinely achieved kill ratios exceeding 20-1. Part of this was superior numbers and logistics, but a significant component was tactical superiority, built on innovations like the inverted roll techniques that gave individual American pilots options Japanese pilots simply didn't have. The legacy of inverted Corsair tactics extended far beyond World War II. The maneuver became embedded in Navy and Marine Corps fighter doctrine, though often without explicit attribution to the Corsair pilots who developed it through desperate necessity. Post-war tactical manuals included inverted rolls as standard defensive procedures. Flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola incorporated negative G maneuvers into the fighter curriculum by the late 1940s. The Korean War demonstrated the enduring relevance of these tactics. Navy and Marine Corps pilots flying F4U Corsairs against North Korean and Chinese aircraft employed the same inverted defensive techniques their predecessors had used against Zeros. The F4U remained in service throughout the Korean conflict, and its structural strength still allowed maneuvers that opposing aircraft couldn't safely replicate. Pilots who'd learned inverted tactics fighting Japanese in the Pacific now used them against MiG-15 jets. The jet age didn't obsolete the tactic, it validated it. Modern jet fighters are specifically designed to handle negative G flight. The F-8 Crusader, which replaced the Corsair in Navy service during the 1950s, had fuel systems and engine designs that functioned normally during inverted flight. The F-4 Phantom that followed incorporated even more sophisticated negative G capabilities. By the time the F-14 Tomcat entered service in the 1970s, sustained negative G flight was considered a basic aircraft requirement. Navy Fighter Weapons School Top Gun formalized what Corsair pilots had learned through combat experience. Instructors taught that when defensive, a fighter pilot should use all 3 dimensions, including negative G maneuvers that break the opponent's tracking solution. The terminology evolved. Contemporary pilots talk about unloaded maneuvers and negative G awareness, but the fundamental concept remains identical to what Kenneth Walsh figured out over Rabaul in February 1943. Modern fighter aircraft can sustain negative G loads that would have been impossible in World War II aircraft. The F-16 can pull negative 4G continuously. The F/A-18 Super Hornet has flight control systems specifically designed to optimize negative G performance. These capabilities exist because combat experience, starting with those desperate Corsair pilots over the Solomons, proved that negative G flight provided tactical advantages that justified the engineering complexity required to make it safe and effective. The men who developed inverted Corsair tactics received limited recognition during or after the war. Kenneth Walsh earned the Medal of Honor for his actions in August 1943, but the citation focused on his kill totals, not his tactical innovations. Robert Hansen received the Medal of Honor posthumously after being killed in action in February 1944. Gregory Boyington became famous as the leader of the Black Sheep Squadron, but his innovations in defensive tactics remained largely unknown outside the fighter community. This anonymity reflected how tactical innovation actually occurs in combat. There are rarely eureka moments or single inventors. Instead, multiple pilots discover similar solutions independently, share knowledge informally, and collectively refine techniques until they become standard practice. The inverted roll wasn't invented, it was discovered, repeatedly, by different pilots facing the same lethal problem and arriving at the same desperate solution. The statistical legacy is clearer than the individual stories. Corsair squadrons that adopted inverted tactics in 1943 maintained significantly better survival rates than squadrons that relied primarily on conventional boom and zoom doctrine. Marine Fighting Squadron 214 lost 12 pilots during their entire deployment from September 1943 through January 1944, while claiming 94 Japanese aircraft destroyed. VMF 215 achieved a kill ratio exceeding 19-1 during their 1944 combat tour. These weren't just superior numbers or luck, they were the measurable results of tactical superiority. Japanese records, where they survived the war, tell the story from the other side. After-action reports from Rabaul and other bases frequently mention American fighters performing incomprehensible maneuvers, aircraft flipping inverted at high speed, diving away in directions Japanese pilots couldn't track, then reappearing with positional advantage. Intelligence assessments from late 1943 began warning that American fighter tactics had evolved beyond Japanese countermeasures. By 1944, some Japanese commanders were explicitly recommending that Zero pilots avoid engaging Corsairs when possible, a stunning reversal from the confident assessments of early 1943. The technological dimension of this story matters as much as the human dimension. The Corsair could perform inverted rolls at 400 miles per hour because Vought engineers had built an aircraft with structural margins that exceeded what they believed would ever be necessary. The R-2800 engine continued delivering power during brief inverted flight because Pratt & Whitney designed robust oil and fuel systems. These weren't intentional features for inverted combat. They were byproducts of conservative engineering and the Navy's demanding specifications for carrier-capable aircraft. Combat pilots discovered capabilities the engineers didn't know existed. This represents a fundamental dynamic in military technology, the gap between designed performance and actual performance under extreme conditions. The Corsair's official performance envelope, as defined by Vaught's test pilots and engineering calculations, didn't include sustained negative G flight or 400 mile/hour inverted rolls. But the aircraft could handle it. Pilots proved it, and that proof changed how the aircraft was employed and how future fighters were designed. The human cost of developing these tactics deserves acknowledgement. Not every pilot who attempted an inverted roll survived. Some experienced G-induced loss of consciousness during the maneuver and crashed. Others misjudged altitude during the dive and couldn't pull out in time. A few suffered structural failures, control surface damage, failed hydraulic systems, even complete wing failures in cases where pilots pushed the aircraft beyond even its generous safety margins. These failures don't appear prominently in squadron histories or after-action reports. Dead pilots don't file reports explaining what went wrong, but the mortality exists in the statistics. Corsair squadrons in 1943 and early 1944 suffered non-combat losses that maintenance records and accident investigations attributed to aggressive maneuvering. Some percentage of those losses involved pilots attempting inverted tactics without adequate altitude, speed, or skill. The survivors learned from these failures. They developed rules of thumb: don't attempt inverted rolls below 10,000 feet, maintain at least 350 miles per hour entering the maneuver, roll through quickly rather than holding inverted, Immediately assess aircraft control after rolling level. These weren't written instructions. They were hard-earned. Knowledge passed along in ready rooms and during pre-mission briefings. The educational cost was measured in lives, but the knowledge gained saved many more lives than it cost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.